I'm not going to say much about him at all, but I'm going to actually start just by asking you to clarify something on your biography, because here it says that he was a founder member of Richard Layard's Happiness Forum, which was a key driver for both the Labour and Tory parties' adoption. So you're starter for 10. Can you answer that? What your role was in that group?
Well, again, I refuse to tell you because I'm about to. That's a key part of the speech.
Okay, it's not going very well. If there are any couples therapists in the audience, we would be very grateful. Oliver.
Actually, it's rather fun for me to come to Dartington because I have strong positive memories of it. Two of my sisters were at school here, and when it was a louche, progressive school, I envied my sisters because attendance at school lessons was voluntary, and in fact my mother came here as well and helped to build a swimming pool. Anyway, the key thing I want to start by saying is actually, it's going to sound like a sort of congratulatory loving, but I don't know if anybody's already done this, but if somebody hasn't, I feel I should. We should all put our hands together to thank Farhad for having actually organised this event, having got off his arse and actually done something about it. The rest of us all sit around moaning, but he has actually been an activist in setting up this conference, and I'm extremely grateful for the opportunity to speak here, and I think we should now clap. Farhad. I'm going to give you a sort of quick crash course in the history of how CBT came to achieve its prominence. And although, in fact, the title of the conference, nice way to get it, but I don't think I said that. And I think I said the Cbt Scam, is I think what I suggested we call it, but Farhad's a little bit more diplomatic. By accident, I happened to be working as a research fellow after I'd qualified as a clinical psychologist, and in 1981 I was working at a sort of what a friend of mine used to call the Institute for Mumbo Jumbo, which was called the Brunel Institute of Organisational and Social Study, and basically it advised health service people on how to sort of manage things better, which is totally ridiculous. And one of the things that a colleague of mine was involved with, rather to my interest, was trying to help two clinical psychologists who in 1981, now some of you are old enough to remember 1981, and in 1981 clinical psychologists were a very, very rare species. They were hardly seen anywhere. There hardly were any. And they decided they wanted to create a profession that would be independent of the psychiatrists and have the power and the status and the income that would give them, considerable influence within the health service. And they'd actually come, it's very interesting, they'd actually come to BIOS to try and find out how the best way to achieve this was. So they've always been a kind of very well organised group, the clinical psychologists, who are the main drivers of CBT in this country. And if you then fast forward to 2002, in the Cabinet Office there was a guy called David Halpern, and under the auspices of another guy called Jeff Mulgan, who set up Demos. Do you remember Demos, the sort of politico-babble Blairite think tank pre the election of Blair? Jeff is a very smashing bloke, but a lot of his stuff was very sort of, the third way was one of the, who remembers the third way, eh? And that sort of drivel. And Jeff, being generally drawn towards drivel, had noticed the happiness evidence and had got young David to do a paper for the Cabinet Office on life satisfaction. And that is really where all the trouble starts, actually, because this was published in 2002, with every single page had "this is not government policy" in bright red across every page. And you can still find it somewhere on the internet, in which David, who's a scholarly chap, and had gone through all the evidence on life satisfaction. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever read evidence on life satisfaction. It's the most superficial form of metric you could ever hope to arrive at, asking people on a scale of 0 to 5 on whether they are satisfied with their life. 0 is very dissatisfied, 5 is very satisfied, completely meaningless. And mostly amounts to a measure of, how many iPods you've got. And Halpin actually has now gone on. He then is now the nudge guru in the Cabinet Office. Or in fact, he has a separate unit altogether, all his own unit. As a result of that, Richard Layard was alerted to this happiness evidence, and in 2003 did indeed set up this happiness forum, and I got an email from him saying, would you like to come and join in? And I thought, well, why not? And all sorts of very scholarly people joined in, and it was done at the LSE, and we would meet up every so often and shoot the breeze about happiness. And now, Richard, of course, I had no hesitation in joining really originally, because Richard, if you're old enough to remember, in the early 80s, it was he who documented the rise in the number of low-income families that resulted from the catastrophic policies of Margaret Thatcher. And it was a very dramatic rise, in fact. In 1979, 19% of children were being raised in a low-income family. That had risen just by 1981 to 31%. And it's basically stayed there ever since, ably assisted by Tony Blair, or Blatcher, as I call him. Now, Richard is, let's be clear, Richard is a very well-intentioned man. He's a very decent man. He's very, very charming. And he was the son of a Jungian analyst, a really old-fashioned Jungian analyst, and was clearly completely put off psychoanalysis for life by that experience. And I can say, being the child of a psychoanalyst doesn't necessarily put you off that, speaking as the child of 2 psychoanalysts, a middle group, you see, not Jungian. Anyway, I think Richard's grasp of the importance of the early years is maybe handicapped a bit, because he never actually has been a parent of small children himself, although he's married and he has a step-family. And I think it's really important, though, the way that he's an economist, and his grasp of, he's also quite elderly. He's probably 10 years older than me, and I'm pretty elderly. And he has teams of researchers who find out things for him, and then he writes them. Very good writer in his books. But his grasp of what, of the actual original evidence, I think, is limited. And he, for example, endlessly retells, as I'll return to again and again in what I have to say this morning, to the claim that genes account for about 50% of why we're like we are. He did write a book, his follow-up to his best-selling happiness book for the Children's Society, about the importance of the early years. But it really wasn't saying, it was a Michael Rutter multifactorial account of the early years. It wasn't actually saying that particularly the early years are important. And Richard, gradually I became more and more disillusioned with the happiness forum. but I continue to attend. Richard published his very successful book, and of course, you know, as those of you who've delved into this at all, again, like life satisfaction, happiness, the vast majority of what Richard is saying, or Andrew Oswald at Warwick University, what they're talking about is based on admittedly huge samples, hundreds of thousands of people, cross-national, sort of stuff that economists love, a very, very simple, crude measure. Most of it is based on simply asking one question. Again, like life satisfaction, if you're very unhappy, 0, if you're very happy, 5, scaling, and then just adding it all up and coming up with a figure for how happy a nation is, a class is, whatever. You know, if I asked all of you on a scale of 0 to 5, where are you on the happy? You know, what would it mean if sort of 10% of you put up your hand and said you're very unhappy, and 10% said you're very happy? You know, what would it mean? I've got no idea what that means. After the happiness book, Richard hooked up with David Clarke, the professor of clinical psychology at Oxford University, a serious operator. And they recently published a book called Thrive, which is an attempt to justify the IAPT movement, as I shall call it. Since it's not science-based, it's more of faith, really. And in Thrive, they make no evidence, no reference whatsoever. I mean, it's the most selective, incredibly irritating book you could ever lay your hands on. It makes no mention of Jonathan's evidence of yesterday. I think it maybe does have a side swipe at Patrick's evidence somewhere, but its main objective is not to even tell you that something like Patrick's evidence exists so that you don't go and look it up. I mean, its objective is to just take you down a tunnel and keep you going on through that tunnel. And it doesn't make any mention at all of the very well-established, very considerable evidence that if you take a sample of people who have been given CBT for a particular problem, although, as we know, it's extremely hard to find a person who only has panic disorder, or only has OCD, or only has generalized anxiety disorder. Nearly always people are comorbid, as Drew Weston's famous review of this in Psychological Bulletin shows. But even so, even if you can find these people and give them CBT and then find a matched sample, and if you follow them up, which has been done a fair few times, if you follow them up more than 2 years, you find there is absolutely no difference in the outcome for the ones who've had CBT and the ones who haven't. And I mean, if you actually go to my website, I put the scientific papers on there, so if you want to actually look at the scientific papers. But there's one particularly telling one, which I'll briefly mention, by Durham, where they had 396 patients in 8 clinical trials who'd been followed up 2 to 14 years after the treatment. Only half of the participants who'd had CBT, half of the participants who'd had CBT had at least one diagnosis at long-term follow-up. And only 18% of the participants had no symptoms or only mild symptoms. And amongst those patients who had more than one course of CBT, they actually were worse than the ones who'd not had any extra CBT. The book skates effortlessly over these kinds. I mean, that is, a study that is very well conducted, is very clearly proving pretty convincingly, when taken with all the other studies of the same kind, that CBT does not work in the long term. In the book, they when they're discussing the causes of mental illness, they simply quote twin and adoption studies to support their contention that mental illness is in general is 50% genetic in cause. They don't make any mention anywhere at all of the GWAS, or Genome-wide Association studies of the Human Genome Project, about which many of you will be probably completely ignorant. But the Human Genome Project, I want to speak about very briefly, is an incredibly important thing, because they announced the results in 2000. They said they'd only found about 35,000 genes. In fact, it's only 23,000, which was way, way less than they were expecting. They were expecting 100,000 genes. And immediately, one of the key, one of the two lead researchers of the Human Genome Project said, well, that proves that individual difference, why one sibling is different from another, cannot be caused by genes, because there simply aren't enough genes. But that didn't stop people. They went on searching for the genes. And what they actually found again and again and again, and I mean without exception, is that heritability for any psychological trait at all is only about 1 to 5%. I mean, it's so negligible as to be not worth mentioning. And I've actually written a scientific paper about this, which you can also find on my website. It's going to be published in the attachment journal, the Carnac book, the Carnac Publishing Company's attachment journal, edited by Kate White, the Bowlby Centre person. That the evidence is absolutely water. This is what I am saying is not my interpretation of the evidence. I'm telling you that the Human Genome Project, it is accepted by all the molecular geneticists who've done it, that they cannot find more than 1 to 5% of the heritability. And what they've done is to dub this phenomenon missing heritability. So, because there's such a huge gap between the twin studies, and no discussion whatever of that in their book. No discussion of the fact that twin studies are very probably going to turn out to be completely discredited. It's going to turn out that twin studies actually prove that shared environment, the shared experience of being with the same parents, is a considerable effect, surprise, surprise, on what children turn out like. And that actually it's shared environment which has been misinterpreted by twin studies as being heritability. Anyway, they also do a very curious reading of the evidence of the impact of social class and low income on mental illness, which it is very widely accepted that people a low income in a developed nation are twice as likely to suffer a mental illness from the general from people of high income. Incredibly, they dispute this. They say, no, we don't think that's true, and it's been vastly oversold, that story. And they have an insidious chart supposedly supporting this, which they don't have any reference for. When they're looking at cross-national mental illness, which is a subject that's greatly interests me, psychiatric epidemiology, to my amazement, they leave out altogether the fact that there are, they say, broadly speaking, everybody all over the world has about the same amount of mental illness. Absolute bollocks. That is absolutely not true. In particular, in the case of schizophrenia, which they particularly, cite schizophrenia, but actually schizophrenia has huge variations of amount of schizophrenia in different nations. You're much less likely to have it if you live in a hunter-gatherer group living in a jungle, and much less likely to have a second episode than if you live in Peckham. And also, we have twice the prevalence of mental illness. It's very clearly proven in the WHO study. Twice the prevalence in this country and in America and in English-speaking nations, an average of 23%, compared with mainland Western Europe, which was not blighted by Thatcherism or Blackcherism. And since 1979, our levels of mental illness have definitely increased, something they dispute without really supporting. Now, why do they go in for all this misinformation? Well, it turns out that what they're trying to do is set the stage for the case against prevention and the case for spending lots of money as soon as possible on treatment. And of course, they've got one particular treatment in mind. They also say, again, they say, well, it turns out that actually it's not really necessary to treat the causes, either the psychosocial causes of the kind that I've been alluding to, or to the individual causes. You can make people cured, and they don't actually use the word cured, they prefer the word recovered. There's a lot of weasel words in that book. They prefer the word recovered because they could easily be nailed if they use the word cured. But they say that you don't need to treat the causes because all you have to do is change people's thought patterns. And they give us an example of the 1998 Amar bombing, where people who were present were studied, and the best predictor of who was traumatized was how they cognized the experience. I mean, a completely empty, vacuous observation can tell us anything at all about why some people cognized it in that way and not others. And what's very interesting, I think, is that when you read this book, is that it reads really remarkably like what you'd expect from an old-fashioned, mainstream, establishment, Maudsley psychiatrist. Not really any different from the sort of person who taught my dad psychiatry in the 1930s, a guy called Aubrey Lewis, who was the kind of Michael Rutter of his time. Absolutely, extraordinary, coming from a supposedly left-wing economist, but who's long since flown off into Jeff Maldon third-wave la-la land, and has lost track of his political ideas altogether, Richard. Somebody who's supposed to be a clinical psychologist, but then of course you slowly begin to see that what they're trying to lead you to, particularly Clark, because he's clearly in charge with this book. What he's trying to lead you to is that the solution to everything is either CBT or pills. So he's presenting a version of talking therapies and a version of psychology and that very much sees people as having these basically unchangeable destinies to a significant degree caused by genes. The Durham study I mentioned earlier, that studied the long-term effects, said that basically whether you looked at people who'd had CBT or not, there was a large number of people the course of whose lives could not apparently change, did not change. They just continued to be anxious throughout for the 2 to 14 years that they've been studied. And there is this sort of idea, basically, that you have in the psychiatric community, and the drug companies, of course, promote this very strongly in a very active way, that mental illness is something that you can't avoid. People like Alastair Campbell, Stephen Fry, all these people are wheeled out to say, look, it's the same story about addiction. I can never change this. I'm like this forever. It's simply a question of managing it. And that's the model that they're working from. A fascinating experience I also had last week was trying to get the message of this conference and to get public awareness of this conference into the newspapers, and from that on to get us out there so that Jonathan and Patrick and all of us can go on Radio 4. There's not much chance of us getting on Radio 4, I can tell you that. It's an incredibly right-wing institution now. You may have noticed the Today programme just has sort of John Humphrys giggling like a schoolgirl as they talk about the latest utterly trivial nonsense, or lots of foreign news, but nothing at all about what's really going on in this country. Anyway, I digress. Radio 4 or such like. And what I hadn't realised was the extent, of course, to which Layard and Clark have succeeded, because, of course, I contacted a lot of people in the media that I know, and at first they said, "Oh, that's very interesting. So you're saying that it's really been proven that CBT does not work in the long term?" I think, yes, I can send you the paper, and I'd send them the scientific paper, send them the evidence, and then after a bit they come back to me and say, "Actually, I don't think this is for us." And of course, the reason they don't think it's for us is because Layard and Clark have been so effective that they have basically got everybody in the media having signed up to their story and having backed it. So it's really rather embarrassing for the Observer or the Guardian or the Telegraph or any of these papers to publish evidence showing and report evidence showing that they've been conned. I want to wind up just by saying a few things that I have personally found from returning to clinical practice after many years of working in television and journalism and writing books. And I say this because I think it simply reinforces my working again with clients, the extent to which I really do feel that what I'm assuming most of the people in this room believe is the right way to go, and the theoretical underpinning of it. That the biogenic model of mental illness, in which you assume that your client has a destiny that is etched in their genes and which there is really nothing we can do about, apart from manage it with pills or the kind of calling black-white of CBT. And one of the things that has really struck me is the extent to which things are intergenerational. Incredible to me. I mean, it's many, many years since I worked clinically. And obviously I come at it now with a very different approach. I mean, originally I trained as a clinical psychologist, but I then worked actually in the Castle Hospital in South London, which is a psychoanalytic therapeutic community. So I was working obviously within the psychoanalytic model, but this was like in the early 80s. And in those days, I mean, it was interesting, it was before the discovery of child sexual abuse. So I remember one of my jobs was to do IQ tests with children who were in the hospital, and I remember doing an IQ test with a 5-year-old girl who was coming out with some stuff that, my ears were burning. I was thinking, good grief, where on earth did she get that from? And I went to my, Hampstead Clinic trained, old school, steam Freudian supervisor and said, this girl is, talking about sexual activity that I just don't believe that 5-year-old girls have any idea the words she was using and the specific things she was talking about. And my supervisor said, Oliver, you are a man, she is a young girl, of course, what do you expect? What? Absolutely bizarre. And that is how people thought, though. I mean, it's really incredibly hard to remember that, but you have to thank Esther Ranson, actually. It was a major, for all the irritating characteristics that she may have. It was Esther Ranson, actually, who broke it open. Anyway, seeing clients now, I'm stunned by the extent to which things are just passing. Man, hands-on, misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. And the incredible role you can play as a therapist, sometimes quite quickly. One client who started with me because her 7-year-old daughter was having tremendous temper tantrums, more like a 2-year-old. And we got into her history, and within a very short period of time, it was quite clear that my client had been treated in a very emotionally as well as physically abusive way by her mother, who in turn, there was a massive documents, diaries that had been written by my client's grandmother, even her great-grandmother diaries, in which they described having been told by their mother that they were foul, that they were ugly, that they were stupid, and that this badness had been punished in them by their mothers. And on it had gone down. And we got it, when we saw this, she was an intelligent lady, and as soon as she could see it, just at a cognitive level perhaps she could see it, but also by having someone listen to her and all the stuff that we know works, she very, very quickly, and also by doing love bombing actually, she very, very quickly turned it round, and within 16 or so sessions, her daughter was no longer having temper tantrums, having been, taken off to the psychiatrist, having been treated, labelled in all sorts of ways, having been potentially about to be given pills, etc. The daughter stopped having any temper tantrums. I mean, absolutely incredible. I mean, I also have to say, one other thing I would just say, purely as a matter of interest, I find that the cognitive analytic therapy movement, which I think is a completely different matter from CBT, I've benefited a good deal from that. I've undergone CAT myself at one point in my life, and in particular at the end of you have the first 4 sessions, for those who don't know, it's 4 sessions about your childhood, and then the therapist writes you a letter, which is basically your agreed narrative, which can be changed, about what happened in your childhood, and then you address the target problem with 12 sessions. And I found that is incredibly helpful, actually, writing a letter, starting off with the childhood in quite a prescriptive way, and then writing them a letter, and if you write the letter in the right way to each client, they seem to value that tremendously. I just throw that out as a thought. But obviously, the thing that's most startling to me is the power of what is now called relational psychoanalysis, but whatever you want to call it, the power of love, if you want. But if you obviously it's not love because you are a client, they are a client and you're a therapist, but it sort of is love in a way, because it is what you're doing is actually really, what I try to do is really make them feel that I am on their side and trying to, want them to thrive in the name of that book. To a certain extent, I quite actively encourage them to experience me as a mother, and I try and change. I think the internal working model is as good a way of putting it as any. You're trying to change their internal working model by giving them a different experience from the one that they had early on. And I want to end by just saying that it's also interesting that, CBT, for all its faults, I think has been helpful to us as dynamic therapists in saying, that it is our duty to some extent to try and actually help our clients get better. When it's the days of lying on the couch 5 days a week, nobody can afford it anymore, but also, that's not the approach, okay? But what I'm saying is, it's not enough, I think, to just sort of let them witter on and nod and be sympathetic. I think, if they're the sort of person who would benefit from doing yoga, I have no compunction whatever about, it's no problem for me to say to them, have you considered trying yoga? If they get flu every winter, I will say to them, have you considered industrial quantities of vitamin D? I do think that CBT, CBT, they say, encourage people to go jogging. I think I'll probably draw the line there, but, they do encourage their clients to kind of do things that actually make sense to help them, for a sort of practical thing. I also think it's fascinating returning to practice that how modern digital devices and communication devices, change things. And that, if CBT had never existed, it might be as dynamic therapists, we'd be slower to pick up on these possibilities. I have a pretty, full-on attitude to clients, and I've got 2 clients at the moment who are quite suicidal. And, I say to them, you email me if you are feeling something. And indeed, with one client, we make an appointment for one particular week. We made an appointment each day for her to call me, to talk on my mobile, wherever I was, at a particular time for maybe 10 minutes, and just check in. I use Skype. I have one client who I have only seen in the flesh 3 times because of various reasons. I have a client in Costa Rica who I've only met once. And I'm staggered by what you can achieve on Skype. Again, that kind of, CBT, to be fair to them, they have said, we just need to do anything. I mean, a lot of them are charlatans. I remember somebody telling me he was training at UCL, and she said, how about something or other? And her supervisor said, look, the way to define CBT is we'll do anything that works, but which he meant is a completely, we'll just steal any ideas from anybody and not give any credit, is what he meant. But I think there is another way of looking at that, which is much more positive. Having said that, I think we, live in what I've often called, we become a nation of shock till you drop, credit-fueled, it could be you, consumer junkies. CBT, of course it appealed to Alastair Campbell, although it didn't work for him, nor did the antidepressants. Of course it appealed to the many depressed denizens at the top of New Labour who all started coming out as depressed. Do you remember at the end, like Blunkett and all these people suddenly started coming out as depressed? Of course it appealed to them. They wanted a quick fix. They got there with salesmanship. CBT is a form of salesmanship to yourself. And it also appeals to a neoliberal society in which problems are individualised, and there is a complete failure to see the bigger picture, either the childhood history or the psychosocial picture. We need a society that puts the needs of small children and their parents ahead of the profits of a tiny few. And my goodness me, we've been going in the wrong direction since 2010. If the question was credit crunch, by what conceivable argument could it be that the answer was George Osborne's austerity? I mean, unbelievable that that's happened. But I'm not pessimistic. I'm not just an optimist. I honestly think that the present situation is unsustainable. And I think that when it happens, and we wake up and smell the coffee and start trying to move towards a more organised, sane, Scandinavian-shaped society, broadly speaking. A big part of achieving the meeting of the needs of under fives and their parents will, of course, be the development of a national talking therapy service, which ensures that psychodynamic therapy is available to everybody who needs it. And again, I just want to end by saying thank you, Farhad, for having gathered us all together here. It's an incredible achievement to have done that. Well done.
I want to say thank you, Oliver. You brought down the tone of our conference. and we love you for it. We're very glad you haven't taken the fellowship, and keep on fighting. Thank you.